All right, folks. Hey, this week I am out of town. I am actually at the beach. So you're not going to actually see a video like you normally would with us doing a lot of tech stuff. But I did get a viewer who wrote in and brought up an interesting point talking about preservation, restoration, and modification off of the video we did a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about best bang for the buck. Not sure at all whether this has anything to do with that, but the idea really struck me hard because I think there is a good deal to say about that fact. Now, the guy you're seeing on the screen right now is my friend Bill Rodishin. Bill worked for Ruger Firearms for 44 years, has done a lot of firearms, both restoration, modification, and preservation. And Bill, I felt like was a really good guy to talk to this fact and this thought line. Bill is a practicing guitar builder. I've seen some of his work. Bill calls himself an amateur. I don't necessarily agree with that because he does some really pretty stuff that I would never be able to do. I can kill more wood than Cecil B. DeMille killed men in movies. So I would say that Bill is better than a beginning craftsman in that ranks. So Bill, what I want to talk to you about and maybe argue with you a little bit about is restoration, modification, and preservation.
Okay, so we've talked, we've argued, and I have explained that not only do I build guitars, but I've done restoration. I've been involved in the restoration business for 40 years. I've done work in places like in the White House, on the White House grounds. Did some work down on Fifth Avenue in New York. One of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing is restoration of old firearms. I've studied this. I've mentored with other folks on this, and I'm pretty passionate about this, not only from a craft perspective, but philosophically, how you look at restorations and sort of approach them from a beginning to end process. So I have probably a little bit different perspective on this than the gut and tear guys that want to go in and sort of just rip things up and just start making things new again. There's times to make things new again, but sort of my philosophy on this is that before you go into a restoration, at least understand what you've got and understand what work that you do on anything, whether it's a car, you know that I love old Jeeps, guitars, or old firearms. At least take some time to understand what you've got in front of you before you proceed to do any kind of work on it.
Now, Bill has a channel. His channel is SIXRounds Studio. You guys should go check it out. I'll put it below me here, and there'll also be a link to his channel in the description below. Bill does firearm restorations. He does stuff on Jeeps. He's got a lot of different things that he's really interested in, which I think is very cool. That's one of the reasons I wanted to bring him in, because I didn't want it to necessarily be just strictly a car guy coming in and talking about this, because he and I got into a discussion about let's just say Wild Bill Hickok's, Winchester. What do you have if you have Wild Bill Hickok's Winchester, and what do you do with that firearm? And there was a couple of other places we're going to go tonight talking about this as well. So what we were discussing is what you should do with that firearm, knowing the lineage of the firearm, preferably having a lot of paperwork to back it up. And basically, what would you say do with that firearm, Bill?
Leave it alone.
Don't touch it.
Don't touch it.
Don't shoot it.
Yeah, don't even shoot it. I mean, for me, the story, the history is everything. There's exceptions to all those rules, and I've talked about that on my own channel a couple times. There are exceptions. Winchester made 1894s. They made millions of these 1894s. From the first to what they're making currently today. And they've made so many of them that to understand the rarity of a particular Winchester Model 94 is important. and every one of them has a history, or every one of them has a story to tell. And it's the story that I think that you get at when you begin to look at these things: the wear marks, the wear patterns, the dings on the stocks. I've got an old Winchester model 1873 that has tacks in it, in a very specific. Yeah, I mean, so you begin to ask, well, what were the tacks all about? Why were those tacks there? We could pull those tacks out, finish that stock, but you've lost that story. You've lost that mystery. Why were those tacks put there? And every one of these artifacts, every one of these guns, like I said, you know my passion for these old Jeeps. Every Jeep has a story to tell, and actually taking the time to understand that story. And you start to wipe it out. So you take Bill Hickok's Winchester. I don't know if Bill had a Winchester or not, but
I'm sure someone will write in and let us know.
Oh yeah, I'm convinced. But it's like Bill Winchester's Bill Hickok's Winchester, rather. What is the story behind it? There's a great story that I tell on my channel about Buffalo Bill Cody. He had an 1873 that he brought to all his shows, and it's now in a museum. And that thing is just beat all to crap because it was a prop in his shows.
Dropped, kicked, I'm sure.
Yeah, all of the above. So that story, that provenance, is everything to that gun, and you start messing with it, and the story doesn't exist anymore. And that goes to every car that you've owned. You and I have talked about my '75 Pontiac. I bought it new. I know every aspect of the car. I know every part that's been changed. I know the details on the paint, everything. It is original. And you know that old story, it's only original once. So I just again, you've heard me go on ad nauseum about this. I'm just very passionate about this stuff.
I think that there is a lot to that. And I think that the thing that a lot of people miss, that there are times for preservation, there's times for restoration, there's time for modification. We discussed this the other day, talking about if you found a Yenko Camaro, or again, let's just say a Chevelle, because everybody talks about Camaros. Let's say we found a Yenko Chevelle in a barn somewhere, and we took it and we broke it into 3 parts. You know, what do you do with it? If it is a running, driving Yenko that just needs to be, you know, cleaned off and everything brushed up a little bit, that's one thing. In my opinion, and your opinion too, I would assume, that vehicle should be preserved.
Yes.
Because it's never going to look like that again if you go and you do something to it. And if you do, it's a restoration, not a preservation.
Right.
Then the other vehicle we talked about was one where you have that same Chevelle, but the engine's blown in it. It's still the original engine. And then what are you doing there? Because you start breaking further away from that preservation mode, because if you want to make it run, you're no longer preserving that engine. You are in fact restoring it, or maybe even modifying it, because the inclination of a lot of people, in my opinion, is, well, you know, while I'm here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to put a fatter cam while I'm here.
So maybe one of the important discussions to have is to define what is a restoration.
Well, didn't you tell me? You told me the other day that the Department of the Interior.
Yeah, the actual is part of the National Park Service. I actually printed it out. And I won't say that I follow it religiously, but I understand the dynamics of the philosophy enough to say that before I do anything, I think understanding what it is you're about to do to that artifact is critical to understand. I sort of mentioned that very early on, but it's the Department of the Interior standards, but it's part of the National Park Service. Okay, so they talk a lot about, you know, the restoration of old buildings. Okay,
right, because I mean that's basically the biggest part of what they would do. Right.
So I mentioned the other day that I've been heading up a restoration on a meeting house that was built in 1794. When you think about this, George Washington was president when they built this building.
That's cool.
So when we began that restoration, the question was, well, what are we going to restore it to? You know, how much of it do we preserve? How much of it do we leave alone? And the more we discover as we take old walls and old ceilings away, that these modifications that were done in the history or in the timeline of the building, you discover things. So as you're discovering things, you're discovering the story. And what do you leave? What do you leave alone? You know, what do you restore? What do you leave? What do you bring it back to? And a lot of that guidance comes right out of the Secretary of Interior standards.
And you kind of have to follow that with what you're doing with the building. I mean, obviously, a dude picking up let's go with the Yenko Chevelle. A dude picking up a Yenko Chevelle has none of those criteria that they have to follow for what they're doing. So,
but if it's a Yenko, they should. This was the argument you and I got into the other day.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I'm like, you know, it's a free country, and there's a ton of guys that are going to write in and say, it's your Yenko, do whatever you want with it. And to a degree, I agree with that. But I think there's also that line that you can cross where it's too much. Yeah. Where you take that Yenko and it's no longer really a Yenko because you've stripped the paint off, you've repainted the entire car, you've put brand new upholstery in, you've got brand new carpet in it. You've rebuilt the engine, you put a 5-speed behind it. Suddenly that is not really a Yenko. It kind of goes back to the ship of Theseus things that we talked about the other day, where the modern line on that from my perspective is, this is my grandfather's hammer. I've replaced the handle twice and my dad replaced the head once.
Yes.
This is my grandfather's hammer.
Yes.
It's not. I don't really think that Chevelle, while the numbers may show it's a Yenko, and it is a Yenko, you have lost that made it a Yenko. In other words, that originality is gone now. You'll never get it back.
It'll never be a Yenko again.
But by that same, this is where we got in our argument. By that same token, if the car is totally crapped out, you know, it's got rust in all the quarter panels, what are we doing? What is our goal on that? I mean,
well, that goes back to the question, what are we restoring it to?
Right. And I mean, we go into that too, because we got off into the whole thing of, you know, this is exactly how it rolled off the assembly line. Because when you start breaking off into that, how far off the assembly line are we talking? Are we talking at the dealership, which would be different than when it goes onto the trailer to go on the train to go to Texas?
Right.
Right. So
that's all part of the story.
Right.
So can you change the story? Sure you can. So, I mean, all of a sudden you've done something to this Yenko. Well, it is truly not in its purest sense a Yenko anymore, but it's something. It became something. It became something because somebody did something to it. All right. Is it a pure Yenko? I would argue it's not. I would argue that you've lost that story.
So have you really though? Because I mean, let's look at it from another perspective. Because this is where the argument started. If you take that Yenko and you say, right, let's just call the guy Fred. Fred bought this Yenko and he took it home and he says, I don't like the manifolds on this thing. I'm going to take them off and put a set of headers on it. Now, this is like the day after he buys it. He's going to go drag racing with his Yenko because it's a really cool, it's fast. Okay. Yeah. So his Yenko is going to take him down the track several hundred times in the lifetime of the car while he owns it. Fred doesn't sell the car, but Fred drag raced the piss out of it, became a name in his region. In other words, let's just say in Houston, Texas, Fred and his Yenko Chevelle were feared. So then what are we doing? Because then you can look at it and argue if it's still in Texas and somebody buys that Chevelle and they know who Fred was, do they restore it back to being an original Yenko? Or do they restore it or even preserve it to show, hey, I found Fred's Chevelle. Here it is.
Well, so here we ask this question. Did Fred leave enough of this thing alone so everything is reversible?
But do you want to reverse it?
Well, can you reverse it? I think is one of the key questions for me. You want to modify it? Okay. Can you reverse what you've done? Can you prove what you've done and then bring it back? So I've seen a lot of these collectors. You know, they'll talk often about how they've made these modifications to these cars, but they didn't make any changes to the cars that were so significant that they couldn't be reversed.
And that's kind of what we talked about in the episode that brought this up, because we were saying, you know, wheels and tires. You can put a different set of wheels and tires on the car, and it's reversible. You can keep the original wheels and tires tucked away in a corner in your shop, and if you want to sell the car, you'll put the original wheels and tires back on and say, hey, I got a set of 17s with sticky rubber on them in the corner. Those are available if you want them as well.
Okay.
It's a reversible thing. You can take it off or put it on. It doesn't matter.
So let me ask a question, Jeff.
Okay.
If you had that original Chevelle,
Mm-hmm.
and you had the original blown motor, and you've decided that blown motor is not worth the nickel.
Okay.
So you put in an aftermarket engine, however you get it. But let's say you save the original motor from the car.
All right.
You put it in storage somewhere. Does that Yanko still exist? Or does that Chevelle still exist? I would argue it does.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I would argue the parts, the components are still there. But I would also suggest to you that if you're the dude that said, okay, this is just a boat anchor, I'm going to bring it to my scrapyard. Okay.
Now, see, I wouldn't do that. I would draw the line at that point. I would keep that original engine with the numbers matching stuff on it, and it would go with the car. Whatever the next guy did with it, I don't know.
Correct.
I would take the original, if the heads were still usable and the intake was still usable and all the stuff that was still a usable
all right
part.
And so now you go in there with a plasma cutter and you cut away all the cross members that are required, and you throw the cross member away.
Yeah, see, I would never do that. I couldn't. And there are guys, and I mean, I've seen these kind of things happen where somebody will take an original car, and it's not usually something like a Yenko, you know, or a Shelby, but they'll take a car that's an original, let's say GT Mustang, GT convertible. I've seen this happen. It was an original GT convertible that someone took the original engine out, put a Mustang 2 front end in, put a 4.6 liter Ford V8 in. It's still a Ford, but it's a late model V8 in an original GT. Would I do that? No. There were not enough original GT convertibles built to justify being able to do that. It's not like the Winchester thing where there are millions of them out there.
All right. So let me steer the question in a different direction. My 1970 Camaro.
Right. We're fixing to get in trouble.
No. So first,
we're about to get in trouble. I may be about to get in trouble.
No. So first month of production.
Right.
First month of production. Early car.
Right.
Okay. Brand new body, brand new generation, brand new everything. Okay. First month of production. Does that hold any weight?
It depends on the year in my book.
Well, it's a 1970. February 1970. First month of second gen Camaro.
If it's the very first one of the second gen Camaro, the very first second gen Camaro, that holds weight. Anything beyond 3, the number 3 on them, no.
Okay.
It really doesn't hold a lot of weight for me.
So we're asking that question. You see what we just did? We just asked the question. Instead of just driving.
I thought you were going to start talking about the engine in your car, because I'm like, there is no telling where that 350
That's my point. But it's still the first month of February, first month of production.
Well, if we're talking about that, we should talk about your Camaro, which is here. That's one of the cars we do on the show. Belongs to my friend here, Bill. That Camaro is the epitome of what we're talking about with the modification side of it.
Yes.
Because that car has just been totally, as far as originality is concerned, it has absolutely been trashed. And it was before, because it was belonged to your brother before.
Right.
And it was done that way when he bought it. In other words, he bought it the way it is.
Correct.
So it's not like your brother did this to the car.
But
that car is.
But we go underneath that car, and almost everything is date coded correct.
Everything, yeah. I mean, that's the stupid thing about it is somebody went in and made that car into a Z28.
Yeah.
Not a Z28. I knew when I looked at the accelerator pedal in it that it wasn't a Z28.
Oh, it's not a Z28.
And not a Z28. We know it probably is an RS, maybe RS SS. We're not sure about the SS part of it.
Right.
I'm almost positive it's an original RS. It was originally Daytona yellow, probably with the black vinyl roof.
Yes.
Maybe. We don't know that for sure either. We'll leave that for
all right. So that begs the same questions. What do we do with it? What do we do with it? Do we leave it?
Well, and you and I've been back and forth on this.
Well, no.
Do we take it back to the way your brother bought it?
That's
or do we go back to the way it was?
Restore it to what?
Really cool. Yeah. Do we take it back?
To what? That's exactly the point. And when you look at it and you discover all the things that have been changed, simply to restore that car back to anything that was original, the amount of effort and work that would go into it, is it possible? Absolutely.
Sure, anything's possible.
If that car, does one of your viewers think bringing that car back to its original state, coming off the factory assembly line, do they think that's worth it? And are they willing to spend the money? Do you imagine the research? Imagine the research that would be required.
Especially, I mean, because the way GM research is, it's really tough. If that was a 70 Mach 1, we would be able to go to Kevin Marty, get a Marty report, and we would know soup to nuts what everything was on that car. The way the GM stuff is set up, it makes that a lot harder because you don't have the ability to go in and say, right, it was originally Daytona yellow with a black interior, it was a 4-speed 354 barrel, you know, with a 350 Positrack rear end. You can do that with a Mustang.
Yeah.
You can do that with a Mustang Torino, any of those cars like that. You can get a Marty report on them. You really can't do that as easily through GM as you can with the Ford stuff.
So that then begs the discussion when we talk about restoring
Daytona yellow.
We got to get there first.
Lord knows it's a long trip.
But that begs that discussion. I mean, that helps define it. I told you about that Winchester that I totally customized, built in 1911. Okay, very early Winchester. They started making the 1894s in 1894, very early, 1911. Okay, it's a stunning example of the industrial art for that period.
Yes.
But the gun was so trashed, and I talk about that on one of my videos. That gun was so trashed, and they, oh, by the way, made so many of them, and I can't prove the history, or at least I could not prove the history when I did the Restomod or the modification or the custom on it. Okay, that was 40 years ago. They didn't have.
You didn't have the information. I mean, even now there's a lot more information than there ever has been.
Correct.
On a lot of the different stuff, like the Ford side. You can find out a lot more now than you ever could before on the car side of things too.
So everything that I had suggested that this was beyond restoration. It definitely could not be preserved because there was literally nothing left to this gun. It couldn't be preserved because there was nothing to preserve. Could it be restored? It could have been restored, but at some point you begin to look at it and you go, well, what am I restoring it to? Okay. So it just made perfect sense to me, considering how many were made, how bad a condition it was in, and how little of the story I could even glean from it back 40 years ago. It made perfect sense to me to do this custom. It's a stunning rifle. It's beautiful. Okay, all high-end woods, high-end finishes. Okay, is it worth anything? Well, it's worth something as a custom.
Right.
Okay.
Do you think a gun like that, a modified gun, this is, I'm going to break this into something else. Do you think a modified gun like that would bring as much as a 1911 Winchester that's been very well preserved? In other words, it's been in the family for ages. It mostly sat on a gun stock in the house. Very rarely would grandpa or dad take it out hunting. You know, so it's got a little bit of wear on it, but it's the kind of patina everybody likes to see. Would that gun, the gun that you've modified, be worth as much as the other one?
That's an interesting question.
Because that's kind of what we're breaking this down to in a way.
It's true.
Something that's preserved, well preserved, like you find a 69 Mach 1, 390 4-speed, you know, beautifully restored, or beautifully not restored, a beautiful original example, showing a little bit of wear, maybe the top edges of the fenders, the black jade on it's kind of worn off a little bit, and you start to see the red oxide underneath, you know, some of those kind of things. But it's so nice. I personally would be loath to touch it. In other words, as far as doing anything to it, I would present that as it is.
Well, yeah, and you and I agree on it. You know how I feel about.
Yeah, I think that is one spot that we do agree on. I mean, there's other places.
I'm very much a supporter of preservation over restoration. Okay, because again, we can't even do a good job defining what a restoration is. You and I talked about this the other night after we argued. you and I talked about this the other night, and we talked about that Shelby Mustang, that they were judging it on a 100-point system, but what they were looking at was an absolutely original car.
That was a good example of that, because these guys are looking at it. You know, they're at a car show. They're trying to just get the job done. I don't mean that in a bad way. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're going through and judging the car. When he shows up, they say, yeah, it's a Shelby. It needs to go in this group over here, and it'll be judged later today. And the guy's like, fine, whatever. They put him in the group with the restored cars, and this is a 20,000-mile original 67 Shelby GT500.
Exactly.
And you can't judge a beautifully preserved and kept example that this guy has owned since day one. He bought it in 1967, got drafted, and then came back and kept the car all those years. You can't judge that with a fully restored 67 Shelby GT500 because of what happens in restoration.
Oftentimes they're over restored. They don't.
I'll give you a good example of that. It's a little bit of story time. So Rick Schmidt at National Parts Depot is a really good friend of mine. I love Rick to death, and he is a great dude. I mean, he is probably one of the in my opinion, a paragon in the automotive hobby, because Rick not only does he run a place that sells parts, he's into it. I mean, he goes to some of the Concours d'Elegances, a lot of them actually, and he'll take cars that they have in their collection that are beautifully done cars. And they use a couple of guys down in Florida, the Breckies, and Lloyd Brecky has a great reputation in the automotive hobby for doing just these incredible cars. And Rick's got a Shelby that his mother had when he was a little kid. So Rick got the car. The car was red for the longest time. It was on a magazine cover. I don't even know if I'll be able to dig it up, but magazine cover for Mustang Monthly. I'm the one that shot the cover with the car on it when it was red. Somebody at the store ran into the car. And now this car in the interior is all original. There's nothing been modified. The engine bay was in really nice shape. Rick decided to send it off to Lloyd Brecky and to have it done. And when he got it back, it was the original Highland green that the car had been from the day one. And it is an absolute gorgeous restoration.
Yes.
Because this is no way, unless it was a Shelby show car in 1967, would any Shelby look like this car looks.
Right.
Going back to the 67 at the car show, you know, this car was a night mist blue car, and the scoops were a different color. They gigged him on that. The deck lid wasn't sitting right. It had big gaps in places. the quarter extensions were not fitting correctly. And there's a reason for that. That's what they looked like when they were brand new.
Yes, yes, yes. Having worked in a factory all my life, I understand this, you know? Yeah.
So I mean but that goes down to what we're talking about. The restoration of Rick's, 68 GT500 KR as opposed to the preservation of the 67 GT500 that's night mist blue.
Right.
And that's really what that boils down to. What do you do with that 67 GT500? You just leave it to Sam Hill alone.
So let me talk about this. Let me talk about this, okay?
Now, what is that? Because there's a lot of guys that will look at that and they'll think that's a really funny looking guitar, but in fact,
it's so I am a musician, okay,
and a good musician. I've heard you play. You know what you're doing.
So I don't only just build guitars; I actually play them. But this is a Gibson F4 mandolin, or F2, excuse me, F2, I think.
Close enough.
Anyway, the point is that this thing was built in 1908. It is all original, but it is in trouble.
That thing looks like I feel most days.
Okay, so here is this instrument that is actually overall in very good condition. It just needs some TLC.
Yes.
So it needs a combination of preservation and restoration. So let me use this sort of define what I'm talking about, okay? So the finish, though it has some scratches and some crazing in it, what would you do with it? So the choice is, well, I could take some sandpaper and sand all this off and then try to replicate it. But why would I do that? All right.
No, I see. I wouldn't want to do that. I want to try to preserve that finish because that's a 1908 finish.
Yeah,
you're never going to get that back.
So let's think about this in the same terms as a car. So there's that original finish, 1908. All right. There are some things that need to be preserved. For instance, all the binding is gone on this side, but I have the original binding that's a little loose that I can now use to compare it to replicate as part of the restoration of that binding. So now I'm defining both preservation and restoration.
Which a lot of guys go past. I think that's something that a lot of guys miss in this, is on the preservation side of things, that you don't have to try to preserve everything on an old car or a guitar or whatever.
Right.
There are things that you should preserve. I mean, if it's let's just say we're talking about a 69 Chevelle. With a big block 396 and a 4-speed in it. And it's got the original shifter in there. And, that was your grandfather's car. I would want to try to preserve the shifter in it if I could, because I'm just that sentimental guy. I mean, yeah, it may not look the best in the world, but my grandfather shifted this car with that shifter. So I'm going to try to preserve that section of it if I can. There's other things that I may pitch over into the wind, like the carpet set or whatever, but there are going to be things that I would want to hang on to, just like with the mandolin. You're going to want to try to preserve that nice, the finish.
Yes.
On the top of it, but there's other things you can't.
Yeah, so I'd want to retain as much of what is original on this mandolin as is even possible. For instance, this inlay. It's a very thin inlay, okay? And as soon as I start to mess with that, I then begin to mess with it, and I risk damaging it, okay? Same with these tuner pegs. These tuner pegs are very specific and very, I wouldn't call them rare, but I would call them very specific to this model year.
Can you get those tuner pegs as a reproduction?
You cannot, but you can find them on the aftermarket, because a lot of these things get destroyed. Okay.
So in other words, you can find them out there, but they're not available as reproductions. My point on that was that a lot of guys might be tempted because of discoloration on the tuner pegs.
Yes.
To just pop them off and put new tuner pegs on that look better.
Yes.
And I'm not really into that. I think that there's times for that, you know, but there's other times when it's like, no, you really want to try to keep that whole patina, that old patina going on that mandolin as much as you possibly can.
Yeah. So there's this headstock. It's split. It's got to be brought together. How am I going to do that? Am I going to use period glues that it was used originally, or am I going to use a modern glue because I feel its sustainability, its ability to live is going to be better. I need to make that decision. All right.
But see, that's kind of, we talked about that the other night too. We were talking about that on the mandolin. And we were saying, and I was saying, there are a lot of guys in the car hobby who will get really anal in the restoration about going in and using lacquer paint on their GM.
Yeah.
When they're basically ripping everything off the car and redoing everything and replacing with reproduction parts. Right. And I have to question why I would do that when I can put a very nice enamel paint job that 99.9% of the people on the planet are not going to know the difference on, except for a few guys at a car show. And I'm going to have all the maintenance worries, because we've talked about that too, even with the mandolins and some of these old Fender guitars. You know, you have the maintenance issues you have to worry about, because it's the finish on them is, you know, it's different.
But here's an important point to me, that you will literally know the difference. So if some future historian goes and looks at that car and understands,
he's going to know.
That's my point.
Yeah, he'll know. But I mean, even what I'm saying is, if you repaint it, he's going to know it's been repainted as well, even if you don't use the lacquer or you do use the lacquer. A historian, it's like we talked about this too. You know, when they train treasury agents to recognize a counterfeit, they don't show them all the different kinds of counterfeits that are out there. They train them to know what a $100 bill looks like, a real one, and all the little idiosyncrasies and details of a $100 bill. They don't train them to know what the fakes look like. They train them to know what the real $100 bill looks like, so that they'll know when they see a fake.
Yeah.
So,
but that comes from, but you and I talked about this also, that how do you know this? Because you look at lots of them.
yeah.
How do I know what a Winchester is supposed to look like if I haven't looked at a lot of them?
Yeah, because if you took out the gun that you modified 40 some odd years ago, and the guy hasn't seen a Winchester, and you say this is a Winchester, and you hand it to him, he's going to turn around. That's not a real Winchester.
Exactly. So that becomes the standard that he judges all of the Winchesters on, which is fake. It's false. Okay. So that, again, that's that whole thing about being over restored. Oh, by the way, this mandolin in original condition, high end original condition, is worth between $5,000 and $10,000.
Wow.
Okay.
And some of those guitars, I mean, there's stuff out there. You and I talked about that before too. There are some Martin guitars that are worth squillions of dollars.
Squillions of dollars. Yeah.
You know, and the same thing with cars, though. I mean, you look at the same thing. You got Shelby's. Some of the stuff that's going absolutely nuts right now, some of the Torinos are actually starting to come up in value. So, I mean, that's you know, it's kind of crazy how that goes. But that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before too, a restored car versus a car that has been preserved, and which is worth more. And I honestly don't have a real good answer for that, because there have been some cars that have brought huge money as a restored car. And then there are other cars that are preserved cars that have brought just as much money, if not more, depending on what the provenance of the car is. Like if it were a Bugatti or a whatever, you know, I think there was a Bugatti that was drug out of a lake, and the car brought I don't know what the exact amount is. So if you do know, please put it in the comments below. But it was like over $1 million some odd dollars. And I know it was I think it was like 3 million. And this car, it's not a nice looking car.
So can I give you another pet peeve?
Uh-oh.
Okay. Because it fits right in. Pet peeve. And I hear this in the car hobby all the time. This Jeep was restored to to museum standards. This is a museum quality restoration. And I just want to know, what in the hell are you talking about? Tell me, define for me. Now, I've done work for museums. Tell me what a museum quality restoration is. Define it for me. All you viewers, help me to understand that.
Well, the other thing you can look at too, there are governing bodies. There are people that, you know, AACA, there's a bunch of different governing bodies inside the car hobby. If you want to take a Mustang and do Mustang Club of America, they have a concours judging setup. They also have one for an unrestored classes. So there's different levels. And it's always like, you know, the concours restored. And it's a funny thing because a lot of it's lingo.
Yeah.
Because in certain areas of the hobby, it's a museum restoration. In other areas of the hobbies, like in the Mustang side of the hobbies, people will tell you I have a concours level restored, you know, a gold car or a gold level concours restored Mustang. I'm not real familiar on the Camaro or Chevelle side, the GM side of the map, but I'm sure there is also something of that realm in there. But it kind of boils back down to what we talked about. One of the things that always blows me away, and I think I'm going to kind of wrap it up into this for the video, is I feel like about 99% of the cars I see at car shows look nothing like they did when they rolled off the assembly line in the early 60s. And I charge that most people today, if you took and put them in a dealership in 1968, they're going to walk around like if you yanked them out of 2021, plopped them down in 1968. Now, I know that a lot of you guys are going to say, yeah, it'd be really cool if I could go buy the car I want, whatever. Let's stop there for a second. But what I'm saying is, you take that guy, you plop him down in 1960. Honestly, if he really starts looking at them, he's going to be really pissed off at what they look like.
Yeah.
Now, I got an example, real quick example on that from Rick Schmidt's collection. Rick has a 1970 Mach 1, and the car is a unrestored car. It was a wrapper car. It never got anything done to it. If you look at the back of the car, it's got the Mach 1 stripe across the back, and it looks like Dizzy put the thing on there because one piece of it goes this way, the center of it does this, and the other side drops down on it. And every time I look at that, it's like a monument to what these cars really look like. One day we're going to go down to National Parts Depot and we're going to drag a couple of cars out and compare like Rick's restored car from the Breckies against a 67 that has never been touched.
I want to be there when you
blow your mind how bad, and I don't mean this in a bad way toward the 67 that's not been touched, but comparatively, they aren't the same. And we are now, I think, so used to a restoration mindset that guys are going to look at those cars that are unrestored and go, man, why did we buy these? Like wavy sail panels, all that kind of stuff. And I love that kind of stuff. To me, it speaks to where we were at and where we are now. You know, you'd have the Lexus thing where you can roll the ball bearing down the fender and it doesn't, you know, the gap doesn't change at all. And that wasn't how it was back in the 60s. You know, there were people back then that made money polishing out the paint jobs, fixing the fenders and making them just so for people who wanted to have that kind of thing done. And I guess to a large degree, there's still people like that, like the Breckies down in Florida, and with what we try to show guys how to do here on the show. But I mean, you know, I still kind of go back and forth on it. Preservation, restoration. We didn't even get off into the modified side of it because I was going to talk about another Chevelle that has no engine or transmission in it, that's a Yenko. What do you do with that? And what I would like for you guys to do for me is to put a comment in the section below. I know if you're a Ford guy, don't give me the answer of, well, I would just, you know, walk or whatever. What I want you to do is to say what should be done to that car. Put in the comments below. We'll try to get in there and answer as many of those as we possibly can. And with that, I think I'm going to shut us down here. I'm surprised that Bill and I were as civil about this because we can really get going we're never mean to each other. We're always laughing, but we can really get at loggerheads sometimes with some of this stuff. But anyway, do me a favor, folks, and go out and check out our Patreon account. At the $10 a month level, you get monthly meetings with me. We'll usually have anywhere from 5 to 20 people in there. It's crazy how that's been growing. Another thing that we're doing for our Patreon guys is doing videos for them, 1 or 2 a month, depending on what we can get away with. And that's just a thank you to the guys who come in there and support us financially on top of what we do here on the show. It will not affect anything we do on Autorestomod or Mechanic. This is just a nice thank you for those guys. Another thing I'd like you to do is go out and subscribe. The algorithms on YouTube have gone nuts, and they have, you need to just subscribe. Go subscribe to Bill's channel for me. Screw his numbers up for me. That'd be awesome. If you guys will go out and just do it so that Bill doesn't really know how to read the numbers anymore, because he's actually my numbers guy, and Bill and I work pretty heavily together trying to make both of our channels grow. So if we can go out and wreck his channel information, that would be very awesome to me. He does some really cool stuff over there. Go check it out. When you subscribe though, hit that bell for notification. If you do not hit that bell, you will never know anything that is going on these two channels, on our channel or his channel. Because if you don't, YouTube ain't gonna tell you squat. Also, finally, folks, do me the favor and be kind to each other, be nice to each other, love on each other. You guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Autorestomod. And Bill, go check it out. He's got some cool stuff. I'm pointing over here, but maybe it's over here.
I'm somewhere here.
He's either, well, maybe, no, he's not down there. He's here somewhere, or over there. Maybe he's, I don't know, maybe I'll put him over the top of me and I'll just talk and Bill will be sitting there looking pretty. Ooh. You guys have a great week.
See you later, guys.